Only a couple of years before the First World War broke out, two extremely influential wars happened with the Ottoman Empire at its center: the Italo-Turkish War and the Balkan Wars. These wars completely changed the look of the Balkans going into the First World War. In this video I will answer the question of what might have happened if these wars didn't happen. How would the course of the First World War and the resulting peace deal have changed? So, how do we make this happen? Well, it's surprisingly easy. While conflict between the Balkan powers and the Ottomans was almost inevitable, the timing of it would be massively impacted by the Italo-Turkish War. The Italo-Turkish War would once again show that the Ottoman Empire was extremely weak, leading to the Balkan powers deciding that the time was right and them declaring war on the Ottomans as well. So essentially, by removing the Italo-Turkish War, we can at least delay the Balkan Wars for a couple of years, which is all we need to have World War I happen and distracting everyone from the Ottoman Empire. So now the question becomes, how do we prevent the Italo-Turkish War? Once again, this is actually extremely easy, barely an inconvenience. Italy acted tough on the world stage, but realistically it simply couldn't compete with the real great powers in Europe, and they needed the support, or at least the approval, from the other powers before they would actually spring into action. So, if we can just ensure that there is some pushback from the other great powers against the Italian invasion of Libya, we can easily delay this conflict for years. Combined with Italy not declaring war, we have the Ottomans putting up a much more tough stance, making it appear like they are modernizing and strengthening, causing more hesitation among the Balkan powers, since without direct Russian support, the Balkan powers simply couldn't go on a 1v1 against the Ottomans with any form of confidence. And, once again, we don't actually need to stall for that much time. For simplicity's sake, we are going to assume that Franz Ferdinand does still get shot in 1914, although a number of other causes could have started the conflict as well. But there was only about a year and a half between the death of Franz Ferdinand and the declaration of war against the Ottomans in our own timeline. So, by just preventing the Balkan Wars from breaking out about 2 years longer, we now have World War I starting, with the Balkans looking like this. And everything else still happens as we know it. Austria sends an ultimatum to Serbia, Serbia refuses a couple of the more insulting points of the ultimatum, Austria declares war on Serbia, Russia and France join Serbia, and Germany joins Austria. Germany invades through Belgium, and so Britain joins the war as well. For the most part, we have World War I as we know it. But then we would get to the Balkans, which would become a minefield of diplomatic and military maneuvers. The Entente would want to get the Balkan powers on their side, with especially Russia pushing for uniting the Balkan powers against the Ottoman and Austrian empires. Britain and Germany in the meanwhile would start pressuring the Ottoman Empire to consider joining the war on their side, while the French were hesitant, but as the Western Front came to a standstill, they too would start looking for new avenues to start a front against the Central Powers. And the Balkans would be the perfect place to start a new front for the Entente. The Ottoman Empire was seen as weak, and there were many independent powers to drag into the war on that front. Italy still had designs on Libya, and the Balkan powers and Russia wanted to divide the Ottoman lands anyway. The British and the French, somewhere in 1915, would start promising Italy and the Balkan powers extravagant amounts of land from the Ottomans and Austria if only they joined the war on the side of the Entente. Now, it is unclear who would join the war first. Perhaps the Ottoman Empire catches on to the fact that, despite their neutrality, their land is being bargained away by the Entente. Perhaps the Balkan powers feel emboldened by the larger war, and so they declare an independent war on the Ottomans, causing the dominoes to tumble and both sides joining a larger alliance. But whatever happens, it does look like the most likely option is that Bulgaria, Italy, Greece and eventually Romania join the war on the side of the Entente, while the Ottomans, out of desperation, join the Central Powers. Somewhere in 1915, the war would look something like this, with the Central Powers in red and the Entente in blue. With the larger world war already going on, we can expect the Ottomans to be a lot more prepared for this eventuality, so their defenses would probably hold a lot better than they did in our own timeline. But on the other hand, the Ottomans would also need to worry about the Russian and British fronts, and their position in the Balkans is extremely risky. If Bulgaria would manage to push out the Ottomans from Thrace, then the entire Ottoman army in the Balkans would become unholdable and unsupplyable, leading to a rout of the entire Ottoman army. So it seems most likely that the Ottomans would be pushed back or retreat for most of the Balkans in the initial confusion of the war. For the Ottomans, it simply makes the most sense to retreat the bulk of their forces from the Balkan theater and going on the defensive there to prevent their main armies from being captured and the Brits and the Russians marching in on the two other fronts. The Balkan nations would then start to push up to Istanbul, but probably without capturing the city itself. After which they would refocus on the defense of Serbia as the war escalates. We could have the Ottomans surrender at this point, seeing it as pointless with the fall of the Balkans and conflict against two major powers. But it seems more likely that the Ottomans decide to hold out and hope that the Germans can pull off a victory, since an Ottoman surrender at this point would more than likely entail the collapse of their entire empire. So at this point, still in 1915, the Balkan front would begin to stagnate between Austria and the Balkan powers, until Germany can finally muster the forces it needs to begin pushing the Balkan nations back. It is impossible to say how successful they would be, but it seems most likely that the Germans managed to push the Entente back up to the mountains of Macedonia and Greece, while the German forces needed to continually hold the Balkans would lead to a weaker German force against Russia. But, all in all, this new front wouldn't fundamentally change the course of World War I. After a new status quo develops in the Balkan theater, the war would continue mostly along the same lines. The Balkan front may move around a little bit, but Russia would still be torn apart by internal issues. Eventually, the war would stalemate with four main fronts: the Austrian Balkan and the Austrian Italian fronts, as well as the Western and the Eastern fronts. The Ottomans themselves would be a bit of a side theater for the Entente. When Russia does eventually collapse, the final German attempt to push the West would be even weaker than in our own timeline, and somewhere in 1918, the Central Powers would fully collapse. So now we get to the more interesting stuff, the peace deals. This is where the biggest changes, and the biggest winner of this scenario, would become clear: Bulgaria. In our own timeline, Bulgaria and the Balkan powers fought a war against the Ottomans, after which Bulgaria and the other Balkan powers had a war themselves, leading to Bulgaria losing a lot of recently captured territory. This led to a disgruntled Bulgaria joining the Central Powers, losing another war against the other Balkan powers and losing even more lands in the resulting peace deal. In this alternate scenario though, the alternate Paris peace treaties would have the unenviable job of figuring out where the borders between the three Entente powers of Bulgaria, Greece and Serbia would have to be. Whatever happens though, Bulgaria would get way more territory than it did in our own timeline, especially since a war between the Balkan powers would be extremely unlikely, with France, Britain and America overseeing and legitimizing any peace deal that's signed. Now, I cannot fully predict where the exact borders are going to be, but here is my best guess with my scenario's border in color and the black outline being the peace deal we got in our own timeline. To start from the top, Romania gained a piece of land from Bulgaria during the Second Balkan War, which wouldn't happen in this scenario. Unless Romania would have joined the Central Powers, which seems unlikely, this border doesn't change. Then we get to Macedonia, which is the most difficult area to predict, as Greek, Serbian and Bulgarian claims overlap heavily in the area. Bulgaria is however the favorite to receive a large portion of the land, maybe even more than I'm showing here, since Serbia is already being awarded many lands from Austria and the Macedonians are ethnically closest to Bulgarians out of the three Balkan powers. The Greek-Bulgarian border is the hardest one to nail down, but I think it may look something like this. But this one is pure guesswork, as there are so many overlapping claims, as well as the question of how the Turkish War for Independence goes. Then finally we have Albania, which didn't exist yet before this scenario's World War I, and the surrounding powers really wanted to divide it. It is possible that Albania gets divided between Serbia, Greece and Italy, or they get independence. But they would be smaller than in our own timeline. And then finally, we have Greece gaining the Aegean Islands. Now, we need to discuss the Turkish War of Independence. It is quite difficult to predict, since we now have Bulgaria and Greece relatively unified against the Turks to defend their recently gained territories. I would put my money on Ataturk managing to defend Anatolia proper from the Greeks, but not managing to reclaim the former Turkish lands in Thrace apart from Istanbul. The island of Rhodes would go to Greece in this scenario, since Italy didn't capture it during the Italo-Turkish War. In terms of the rest of the world, the Balkan front wouldn't fundamentally impact any of the other peace deals. and we still see the other Central Powers divided in much the same way. Now apart from Bulgaria, the biggest change would be Italy, who would still not gain as much as was promised to them, but at least they would have received a rather large chunk of land in Libya directly from World War I. While being little more than a petty prize when compared to the other colonies up for grabs, it could still be a massive propaganda boost for the ruling party. Would it be enough to prevent Italy from falling to Mussolini? Doubtful. The Italians would still receive less than expected or promised, and their economy would still be in ruin, making the fascist party quite popular with the veterans. Now, going any further than this becomes very difficult, since I don't think that the Balkan border changes will fundamentally impact the Second World War. Some Balkan powers will willingly join or be forced to cooperate with the Axis, some others will get steamrolled by the Germans. Even if all the Balkan powers somehow got along perfectly and joined the Allied powers together, I doubt that Germany would have much difficulty in simply overrunning the region. At the very least, Hungary would still likely join the Axis due to their territorial claims, and Romania would also join out of fear of the Soviets. But as for Yugoslavia, Bulgaria and Greece, I simply cannot say. Maybe an expansionist Greece once Bulgarian lands and joins the Germans, although this move would be very unpopular with the Italians. Maybe Bulgaria sees the opportunity to join Germany and become even more dominant over the Balkans. It's simply impossible to tell. But the biggest change that would happen from these border shifts in the Balkans is that they would more than likely stick for the most part, as the Soviets would likely restore close to pre-war Balkan borders when liberating the region. Especially considering that respecting Bulgaria's post-World War I borders would mean that the Soviet satellite state of Bulgaria is larger, while the Western aligned Greece and the neutral Yugoslavia are smaller. Without the collapse of Yugoslavia, Greater Bulgaria could very well survive into the modern day, maybe with giving the Macedonians a bit of autonomy, but it's definitely not unthinkable that Macedonia would over time become an irreplaceable part of Bulgaria proper. So that's where I'll end this scenario. Thank you all for watching. To support the channel, leave a comment and a like. Even just commenting hi helps the channel grow massively. Subscribe for a new alternate history video every single week, as well as much other history related content. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.